Hello, everybody, and welcome to another fantastic episode of Truth Wanted. I'm your host, ObjectivelyDan, and this is the show where we talk to callers about what people believe and why, with special guests every single week. And this week's special guest is author. I'm gonna say author, writer. Author. That implies you have like a book, but you don't have a book. I mean, you write stuff on the internet.
Yeah, so if you count tweets as writing, then I'm an author.
That's true. Hey, then I'm a writer too. Then
I'm taking it.
Okay, fine. All right, sure. We're just all writers here. Writer Jaime Woodhouse is joining me on the show today. Jaime is a writer, as I said before. He runs the website Sentientism.info. You have a podcast with the same name, the Sentientism, and you have writing that has been published in other publications as well, including the Secular Humanist magazine and just like a lot of different places. So, Jaime, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Dan. Thank you.
Yeah, and so we had this. I want to get you on for a couple of different reasons. So I want to give a backstory a little bit about how we met. We met through a mutual friend, and I was kind of looking up. I do this thing every once in a while where I kind of look into. I'm a nerd, so I'll look up different subjects that I'm kind of into at the time. And I was looking at stuff on ethics, and at the time, somebody had introduced you to me and said, "Oh, hey, this guy writes about this idea called Sentientism. I think you'd be really into it." And I saw that you had written a piece. Again, for Secular Humanism, which was called, what was the name of this piece here? It was Sentientism, Evidence, Reason, and Compassion. Oh, that's the article that you have on your site. But you wrote a piece.
I think it was, does humanism need an upgrade?
Humanism needs an upgrade. Is Sentientism the philosophy that could save the world? There's the title for that. And so right? So yeah, it's an interesting title. And I looked at this and I found myself more convinced of your writing than anything. And I looked more into it and I thought, this is an interesting idea to explore on this show, because I think broadly speaking, the majority of people that watch Truth Wanted probably identify as humanists. And while a lot of us probably share similar ideas of what that means, the idea that humanism needs an upgrade, the idea that we could like change it and modify it because it's not sufficient enough, is kind of radical almost, because like it was already radical enough to become a humanist, right? Like that's not like a common thing. That's not a thing that most people know even what that is, at least in the United States. If I asked, if I went to 10 different people at my apartment complex, I'd be lucky if one of them, I think, knew. And so like this idea that, here's an expansion of that called sentientism that we should all consider is kind of interesting. And so I guess, let's start this conversation by just talking about like, what is sentientism for you?
Yeah. So I guess it's a worldview or a philosophy like humanism. So it's trying to answer the two deepest questions, really. What's real? How should we choose what to believe? And then just as importantly, what matters morally? What should we care about? What should we have compassion for? So I summarize it in 3 words as evidence, reason, and compassion. But where humanism tends to use a similar definition, you might summarize humanism as evidence, reason, and compassion for all humans. The difference with sentientism, the clue's in the name, that we talk about evidence and reason, but having compassion for all sentient beings. And in simple terms, that means anything that is capable of suffering. So rather than saying we care about all humans, we care about all suffering. And it's not just humans that can suffer.
Yeah. And so the way that I understood it as you wrote it is that there's kind of 3 different areas of expansion here, right? And correct me if I'm wrong. And the first 2, I think, are simpler than the last one. So I want to talk about those first 2. The first one being like, life that's beyond human life outside of Earth, right? So like, like this is kind of the most hypothetical part of it, I think, because obviously, as far as we know, we haven't encountered intelligent life, that we can like have a conversation with or interact on like a civilization based level, right? But if we did, and let's say they call themselves like Zorgons, we will hope that they're not Zorgon supremacists, right? Like we would want them to consider us because we're sentient life. So we, want to be considerate of them, right? So that's kind of like, would you say that's a fair understanding of?
Yeah, we'd better hope they're sentientists, because we want them to have compassion for us and not just turn us into a food source or, steamroller us.
Yeah. So that makes sense to me, right? So like the human supremacist thing, that kind of falls apart if we're considering this hypothetical. Okay.
Yeah.
So the second one, and again, this is also hypothetical, but in my eyes, a little more sort of a reality, because I think this is something that I will probably have to experience in my lifetime at least, which is this idea that we have to respect upcoming like artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And when I first heard about this, and I want you to expand on this, of course, but like, yeah, this intuitively makes sense to me. I think if we had this conversation 20, 30 years ago, people would think, oh, that's kind of a little out there. But now everybody has an assistant in their homes that can understand what they're saying on like a keyword level, I guess. And like, yeah, it's still like superficial, but it's getting better every day. And it's only a matter of time until like the lines between those things are going to be blurred, right?
Yeah. And this is a lot of different sentientists will have radically different opinions about whether computers or artificial intelligences could ever be sentient. Some think it's not possible. Others, like me, think it's probably very hard, but possible. There's no conceptual reason why it couldn't happen, partly because personally, I see sentience as really just a class of advanced information processing that in us happen to evolve out of an ability to model ourselves in an environment, but there's no technical or conceptual reason why we couldn't design that into an artificial intelligence, or increasingly the artificial intelligences that are designing themselves. So it's an in principle thing rather than sentientism doesn't have a particular view about whether that's likely or possible or when it will happen. It just says if we got to the point where we had some reasonable degree of evidence that this artificial intelligence could actually subjectively experience suffering and flourishing, then we would have to grant it moral consideration, and harming it would be seen as a bad thing to do.
Right. Yeah. And based on the principles you just outlined there, like that totally makes sense. If we, the problem, of course, is, and I want to talk about this later, is how we exactly define sentient life. That's kind of a sticky one, right? But then again, we also don't have a full definition of what life even is.
Yeah.
And that doesn't stop biologists from studying biology, right? So there's room to grow in that area for sure, but it makes intuitive sense to me. And as someone who considers human beings to be just biological systems, someone who thinks that we're just information processing systems, a silicon-based system is not only probable, I think it's very likely. I think that's something that we'll probably see in our lifetime, and we'll have to deal with the ramifications of that. And obviously a lot of science fiction's been devoted to that, but it seems more real now than ever. I mean, I know you've seen those Boston Dynamics videos and stuff.
Yeah. it's crazy shit, isn't it? It's crazy. Yeah,
it's crazy.
And part of the reason, some people think, both talking about the idea of aliens or artificial intelligences is a sort of nerdy sci-fi intellectual pursuit just for fun. And in a way it sort of is, right? And that's partly why I find those things fascinating, because I do enjoy my sci-fi. But I think it's worth taking those subjects seriously, because if we do it in the right way, I think it can actually improve our human ethics as well, because it forces us to crystallize and think about why we care about what we care about and how we should treat things. So even if, artificial intelligence never happens and we never encounter sentient aliens, I think thinking through these things can actually help us, be with each other as humans and sort of more grounded day-to-day ethics as well. So that's my excuse for talking about the sci-fi stuff a bit.
Well, I mean, fiction does inform our worldview, because it does give us those hypothetical scenarios in which we have to live out, like, how would we react in this situation? So
there's often better philosophy in science fiction than there is in actual philosophy, I think.
That's a hot take, but I don't disagree with you, actually. I mean, if we're talking about like what is relatable to people in a popular sense, I think a movie like Blade Runner is going to be way more palatable to most people than like I don't know, Zizek or something. Like if we're talking like if we're gonna or any modern postmodern contemporary philosophers could ever give about the concepts of the things that we talked about. So on those 2 points, I think that makes sense. That it's pretty rational. I think a lot of people would agree. Now, here's the third one, and this is where I expect. I think a lot of our conversations, and you know, I see your face. I know we both know what this is, because this third one is talking about non-human animals and how we relate to them. And so, like, I think this is a discussion that has not been fully fleshed out, at least in the communities that, you know, I run circles in, right? As far as what the ethics of this are. And because, like, we have to have a response, because we live in a world with non-human animals, and we already kind of have these conventions and rules and what we think is appropriate. But if we really look at it, a lot of it is kind of culturally defined. A lot of it is kind of arbitrary. And and a lot of it isn't based on good science and evidence and reason, which are these things that we, like, you know, want to champion as humanists, I would think. So
that's the thing about this. That's the thing about this community, right? Is whether we're atheists or free skeptics or humanists, we are, you know, committed to using evidence and reason, taking a naturalistic approach, always being open-minded, looking at new evidence. But we're also supposed to be careful moral thinkers who are willing to challenge social norms and traditions and childhood indoctrination and try and find a more reasoned way of, you know, being better people, right? So in a way, I do have a higher expectation of, you know, our sort of community and audience than maybe the average person on the street. So
and like the way that we treat non-human animals goes back to what it means to be human itself, really. I mean, human civilization has been built on the backbones of non-human animals, in terms of the labor that we've used to exploit for them, in terms of the diet that we've attained from eating these animals and stuff. And so to change our relationship with them on any level is going to be radical, regardless of the culture that you're from, right? It's just something that's so ingrained with us, this sort of internal hierarchy that we've built. But what does Sentientism say about this hierarchy? And I understand there's different schools of thought about this, but what does Sentientism say about our relationship with animals?
So one of the things that might annoy people about Sentientism, but I think it's quite powerful, is it's deliberately quite basic. So it's just trying to set what a philosopher might call a sort of pluralistic baseline or a platform. So it's not trying to answer all of the problems. It's not saying how you should make different sorts of trade-offs between different interests or how you resolve all the trolley problems in the world. It doesn't even have a view, you know, for your audience who are familiar with different philosophical schools of thought around utilitarianism or consequentialism or deontology and rules or virtue ethics. It doesn't even tell you which of those to pick. It just says, build your beliefs probabilistically and provisionally using evidence and reason, which is exactly consistent with, you know, humanism. And then it says, have moral consideration for any being that is capable of experiencing suffering or flourishing, anything that's sentient. But that still leaves a lot of room for maneuver. So there are some sentientists, and I think I haven't done a proper survey, right, but I think they're in the minority, who will say that any even minimally sentient being should be given the same moral consideration, equal moral consideration with all of the others. And they'd argue that even though, you know, maybe a simpler animal might have a less rich sentient experience than a human, you know, we might be able to feel existential angst or a sense of our plans being thwarted, or maybe some sense of social connections that really simple animals don't have. So maybe we can suffer in ways they can't, which might put us up the pecking order. Some of those people would say, okay, but at the same time, just because that animal's experience is simpler, who's to say it might not be just as viscerally and morally important? And in fact, you know, a more advanced being like a human might have ways of mitigating suffering because we might understand the context for it. We might be able to meditate. We might be able to soften the suffering in some ways. I think, to be honest, even those people, when you put them in the thought experiment of, you know, you can only save either a chicken or a human child from a burning building, right, they're still going to save the child, right? So I think, to be honest, even the people who take quite an egalitarian stance under pressure will still take a more common sense choice. But my personal view, and I think where many other sentientists are, is that they say, well, if sentience really is just a class of information processing, that involves modeling ourselves as an entity in an environment and having, a rich awareness of that based on lots of different inputs from our senses and our perception and our internal processing, then there's an enormous variety of that type of sentience as well. It's not just on or off. There's an enormous richness. You could have different degrees of sentience, and if you can have different degrees of sentience, maybe it makes sense to then give different degrees of moral consideration as well. So in that calculus, you would think about, again, in a more common sense way, I do see more value in a pig maybe than in a
cockroach.
A cockroach or something.
Yeah.
Just because of its computational complexity or the our judgment about the level of richness and experience. So there's space for thinking about different degrees of moral consideration there as well. But what sentientism does is it says even the simplest sentient being still warrants some meaningful moral consideration. So what that means is that we should feel compassion for it, and we should see needlessly its suffering or death as a moral negative. Mm-hmm. So it does draw still quite a firm baseline that says, even as with humans, sometimes killing or harming human is still morally the right thing to do because it's justified by, other reasons. And that can be true for non-human animals as well. So it doesn't say a non-human animal or a human could never be harmed and never suffer, but you'd need a really strong justification to do that. So causing needless suffering or death to any sentient being would be seen as a moral negative.
Yeah, it like intuitively this really makes sense. I think this makes sense for a lot of people. I think putting this into practice has been a journey for me to kind of figure out as I've thought about this more, and something I'm just surprised that other people aren't as willing to talk about. I've been really nervous talking about this, to be honest. I go on every week and talk all kinds of stuff about Christianity and all kinds of stuff about atheism. But
you're breaking taboos left, right, and center.
I'm breaking taboos left, right, and center. But this right here, it feels like I'm breaking new ground because I do feel like I am a minority within a minority when I talk about this. But even if my conclusions on this subject are not viable, right, or not something that we should be logically following, I would still like to see even more conversations about it because I want to know if I'm wrong about this. But I think the systems that we have in place, the way that we treat animals, is just not philosophically justified. And when I think about my cat Pico, and Americans in general, we love our cats and our dogs, and that has not always been the case, historically speaking. We're much better about that now. And I think about a pig. There, in terms of what intelligence, okay, one, that's a messy metric in itself, but a pig can do way more than my cat in terms of being able to problem solve. There's that one study, I know you've seen it too, about the pig that can play a video game, literally with a joystick and a cursor on a screen to get food and stuff. My cat can't do that. Okay. And it's that is a being that, just like my cat, seems to have a subjective point of view with a subjective sense of suffering. And recognizing that has led me to believe that I can't contribute to a system that causes harm to that. So that's a pretty radical thing. That's a difference in the entirety I've been living my life. And it's disruptive to talk about the systems, but to perpetuate these kinds of harms, because we there's lots of things to this conversation, right? So
but I think it's fascinating because the parallels between what you've just described and religion, I think, run really, really deep. Because once you've gone through the journey that you went through and that I went with regards to religion, while you're inside it, it's the most natural thing in the world. It's almost unquestionable. It's so deep. It's so obvious. Everyone around you thinks that way. It's clearly the answer. Almost from birth, you were told by society and parents and priests that these things were true, right? And it's actually quite a painful, difficult process for some people. Some people it's not. Some people, the light goes on and it's easy. For some people, societally and practically and intellectually and emotionally, it's a real trauma trying to turn away from that stuff. But once you're out of it, you look back and go, how was I ever trapped for so long, right? With clear eyes, it's so obvious the evidence just doesn't stack up at all, right? How could I have ever believed it? And not only is it clearly unfounded in evidence and unsupported by reason, but there's loads of really awful ethics in religion that I just accepted, that now I look at them and I think, look at the homophobia, look at the sexism, look at the caste discrimination, look at, the embedded racism, look at the apostasy, look at the what was going on, right? As soon as I see with clear eyes from scratch, those things are obviously ethically unacceptable. And it feels like the journey around non-human animal ethics can be a little similar, right? Because again, if you start out as a 2 or 3 year old child and you introduce them to a family pet or a pig or a cat, there are small children who, yes, they will experiment and pull wings off flies, but most young children, certainly with a farmed animal, if they have a chance to spend some time with it, you or I might do the science and put them in an fMRI scanner and observe their behavior and do some ethological studies and form a probabilistic view about whether they're sentient. But you and I and that small child can just look into their eyes and viscerally knows that that animal is capable of suffering, and we don't want to hurt it. But again, the parallel with religion is that almost from birth, we are taught by parents and society and family that it's completely normal and accepted, and in fact, almost demanded, to pay somebody else to harm and kill a sentient being that probably is cleverer than the family pet, dog or cat, purely for a transient taste preference or a social norm that, we have culture and traditions built around these things. So it's maybe it's self-serving because these are two of my favorite topics, but it does seem like there's a real parallel between that sort of religious indoctrination and the indoctrination that non-human animals, their suffering just doesn't matter enough to warrant that consideration. Seems strange. And those topics are like kryptonite to otherwise careful thinkers. So in the same way as, we all know those scientists who still hold on to their religion, and we're like, how are you doing that?
How does that make sense? It doesn't really add up. Yeah.
To be frank, I feel that way about humanists who don't understand or refuse to engage with non-human animal ethics. It's a similar frustration. It's like, how can you not see this?
Yeah, like as someone who's like, one of my favorite topics of science is anthropology. And if anything, anthropology has taught me, historically we've thought of animals as being so far away from humans that there's this huge hierarchy of difference, and Christianity plays into that narrative as well. It teaches us that we're the special creation and stuff. But if anthropology has taught me anything, gosh, we are so close to all of our current living ape relatives and even the ones that aren't here. And I think if you told most people in both of the societies we occupy, oh, I want to have a gorilla burger for lunch, like, I think most people would be appalled. And I think there's a reason for that, even though that's not a human, but we recognize that there's an intelligence there. There's something there. I don't like using the intelligence word either, because that gets really messy with stuff. But the sentience label, I think, is a bit more comfortable, even though that's also messy, because intelligence still implies a weird because like I wouldn't treat somebody that is less intelligent than me any different than somebody who is more intelligent than me. So like that's why I don't like using that word, right? Because there's kind of a weird thing with that, and like with eugenics and stuff that I don't like. But the sentience thing makes sense, because it's like, like you go to the zoo and you look at the gorillas and you look at orangutans and you look at these non-human animals. And it's like, okay, I see something there that I can relate to in more ways that I may not be comfortable admitting. And that it just raises questions about how we've structured our entire systems of food production and how we've chosen to kind of live the lives up until now. Obviously, we're talking about veganism right now, but like that's where this conversation kind of goes to when we talk about sentientism. And so like it leads me to the conclusion that being a vegan is what I have to do, but obviously that's not as easy for everyone else. And there's a lot of conversations about access and stuff, but I don't know. What do you think about veganism and sentientism, this link there? Do you think it's a natural conclusion, or are there other options?
The short answer is yes. And I think the reason for that is that if you have compassion for sentient beings, that would that has a massive overlap with what veganism really is, which is just trying to avoid causing suffering. And veganism can sometimes come across as more than that, or more demanding than that, or very specific, or if you think vegans are annoying to non-vegans, they're even more aggressive to each other about what veganism is. And
yeah.
It's crazy, right? But there is a very strong overlap, because the motivation behind the two is consistent, which is just trying to reduce the suffering and death we cause. But I think there's an important point to make, and you won't get this impression from some preachy vegans, and I must admit I can't help being a bit preachy sometimes because the morals just seem so obvious. But let's put that one side. There is no perfection, right? So I don't really think it's possible to live a life in the modern world where you don't cause some form of suffering to some form of sentient being. So it's not a binary thing on and off, where there's some sort of perfect ethical state that vegans have achieved where they can look down on the rest of us as with disdain because we're not pure enough. That's the impression you might get. But that's just bullshit, right? It's like any other ethical question. There isn't a question of perfection. It's just a question of trying to do better. But yes, that is one obvious way you can reduce the amount of suffering you cause in your life, is by not consuming products that require the suffering and death of other sentient beings. But I think it links back to the way I understand naturalism. To be honest, atheists and humanists can come across quite arrogant, and we have the perfect answers and we have all the facts, and
science, Jamie, yes.
And science is perfect already, right? And we know how that turns people off, right? So that sort of aggressive, we know it all starts from a naturalistic perspective is just as annoying to someone who's religious or supernatural as a aggressive vegan is to someone who isn't. But there's a parallel in both. It is that a sensible naturalism has to have doubt and humility and open-mindedness at its heart, right? So in a way, I think, in the same way as that naturalism has to have, we're never 100% sure, we're always open to new evidence, we're always getting less wrong, we're always open to being self-correcting. We need to apply that in our ethics as well. We need moral uncertainty. It's not about calling people out for failing to be perfect. It's just about trying to do better and cause less suffering.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes sense to me. And there's also different reasons why people become vegan that may not be the same reasons that we do it as well. I've noticed this since I've kind of started this journey for myself, and that the people who are vegans for health reasons I've met are different from the ones who do it for ethical reasons. And it's like, it's almost like I don't relate to the ones who did it for health reasons. Because one, I personally did not think veganism was healthy. I really didn't. And depending on how you do it, it's not. But like that aside, like the way that people approach the lifestyle of veganism is fascinating, because you have people like us who are really trying to think about all the ins and outs of these ethics and all the systems we're contributing to. And then there's some people that are like, yeah, I just want to look like that person on Instagram or whatever. It's like, okay, well,
they've seen Rich Roll's abs or something.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I guess, and some people think that's a bad thing. I guess that's not a bad thing as long as people are living healthily, I guess. But I don't know.
I think it's still a good thing for a couple of reasons. One is because just technically it does actually reduce the amount of suffering that's being caused.
Right.
So whatever the motivation, if it's environment or health or something else, it's less suffering is good. So I'll take that as a small win. But I think the other thing that's interesting is it's really hard. And I think, again, there's a parallel here with religion. It's quite hard to condemn a system morally that you're part of, that you're involved in day to day. But if you free yourself from it, so if you give up animal products for health or environmental reasons or some other reason, once you're outside of that and you're no longer part of that system and that process, actually, a lot of people find it easier to then upgrade their ethics in line. So the behavior shifts first, and then their ethics come in line. They find it much easier to go, oh, I'm so glad I'm no longer causing that suffering, even though that wasn't the first motivation. So I think it can still be, I'll take any route into moving away from animal product consumption.
Yeah, I definitely have more reasons for doing this now than I did even when I first started. So obviously people's ideas about it can change as they're getting into it and stuff. But Jamie, this is a call-in show, allegedly. Yes. So we should probably get to some calls here, right? We got some great calls lined up, and I want to talk to everybody that is on the line. But before we get to that, I have to thank our awesome patron of the week, That's right, folks. Every single week, we give a special shout out to our awesome patrons who donate on patreon.com/truthwanted. And the patron this week is David Polson. Thank you so much, David, for donating. If you guys would like to donate, you can do that again on that Patreon link I just said. All that money goes towards making this show happen and towards making stuff at the ACA happen. It's really, really cool. I'm a volunteer at the ACA, so I don't personally receive any of that, and neither do the other volunteers. It goes towards, again, just making these shows happen every week. So thank you so much, David, for donating to the show. And now it's time to get to some calls.